Well, climate change has been seen for decades as a very, very important environmental issue, also as an increasingly important economic issue, as well as an issue for society, for citizens, and of course policymakers who have to take decisions either locally, nationally, at the European Union level, or internationally on climate change. Since 2007 particularly, climate change has been also identified as an issue for peace and security. What does it mean? The impacts of climate change on specific resources and on specific areas of the world which receive specifically strong impact on climate change might also lead to exacerbating conflicts when there are conflicts at stake, either within countries or between countries. And it can lead to certain threshold in dealing with scarce resources more difficult to address in terms of cooperation versus conflict. So from that point of view, the security dimension of climate change has been recognized as a possibly additional element, of course not disconnected from the environmental, social and economic one, but as an addition to those elements. It has been identified as a multiplier in the sense that if there are already certain tensions, either within or across borders, the fact that climate change impacts might make certain resources like water, like land, like coastal areas, like mountain, ice, and so on, more scarce, can lead to certain tension. Climate change impacts do exacerbate conflict. They are not the only cause of conflict. It's true that war have been happening over natural resources, grabbing land, grabbing sea routes, and grabbing energy. But climate change as a contribution to war to start, or conflicts already happening to increase, or new conflicts to arise, is to be considered as one of the elements in connection with other elements. This is not to diminish the importance of climate change impacts, but to make sure that they are understood for what they are as one of the possible multipliers, therefore preventing those climate change impacts or addressing them in a way that doesn't lead to further conflicts, possibly especially when it's violent conflicts, is an important task. With regard to the Middle East, the example that I would take is the management of the Jordan River basin. What has been noted in many studies, and there is a database on international agreements dealing with the river basin, is that managing river basin across different countries that have different needs and need access to the river water has been most often addressed in a peaceful way. I mean, this is a problem, and countries along the basin found ways of having an agreement on how to manage the river basin. The Jordan being an example, the Nile, the Mekong, several others are examples. Now the point is, this has been the case so far. Is there a risk, this is what we need to understand better, that climate change impacts on water, including the water of rivers, might lead to this fragile equilibrium of sharing the resource peacefully be at risk and further tension to arise. So this is one of the examples. Another example that, as I suggested I was making, is about the Arctic route. Unfortunately, the melting of the ice cap is a fact which has been proven by science and monitoring of the ice caps. Now, this can be seen as representing a terrible environmental threat because of what this implies for loss of biodiversity, sea level rise, and so on and so forth. It is also seen as an opportunity to start two Arctic routes, one through Canada, the other through Russia, which are of course extremely, extremely precious. This is seen as an opportunity. The fact of seeing this as an opportunity can lead to not seeing the threat, not only the environmental threat that I was mentioning earlier, but also the threat of clashing interests to obtain the access of those routes. And in addition to the access to those routes, there's also the issue of access to oil and other minerals. And as we know, the issue is, will this be addressed peacefully, or will this create tension? And this is directly connected with climate impacts. The third I was making very quickly is that we hear sometimes speaking about environmental refugees and climate change refugees. There is one case at least that has been demonstrated to be one of those cases, possibly not many others that have been mentioned, and this is the case of the inhabitant of the small atoll islands near Tuvalu. This has been addressed also in a cooperative way through an agreement with New Zealand, which agreed with Tuvalu, Kiribati, Tonga and Fiji islands to have their population integrated in New Zealand in case of sea level rise. As I said, there has been already one case, one of the atoll islands had to have their inhabitant welcome to New Zealand. As I mentioned, other countries in the Pacific, including Australia, have not been cooperative in this regard, at the time at least. Therefore, this raises the issue in similar cases, will we always be able to act cooperatively, or will there be tensions to be addressed? It has been definitely addressed, and with great seriousness. I must also, however, note that I'm speaking on my personal capacity. I am not the negotiator on climate change issues at the Commission nowadays. And the work I'm doing in the Research DG is, if you like, on science diplomacy and international science cooperation, and climate change has been one of the elements that is not the main. Now, the European Union not only has been working and leading in climate change agreements since decades, since 1988, but in 2007 also issued a joint paper of the High Representative on Common Foreign and Security Policy and the European Commission, particularly the Commissioner on Environment at the time, a joint paper on climate change as a threat to international security. And this has been, in fact, one way of acknowledging that in addition to the environmental dimension, the economic dimension, social dimension, the security dimension of climate change, again, as a threat multiplier, not the only cause of war or conflicts, should be addressed by the European Union and its partners. I think that there are three scenarios with different degrees of likelihood, but the likelihood is only assessed in a subjective manner for the time being. And of course, when I speak about scenarios, I speak about envisioning the future, not predicting the future. And the three scenarios I think we can consider are: the first, if you like, is the positive scenario, what I call greening security, meaning by considering the security implication of climate change, we give even more importance to climate change and the need for mitigation, prevention and adaptation policies to avoid also certain tension and conflicts to increase or be exacerbated by climate change impacts. And we might have also other actors in addition to the actors that typically and correctly dealt with climate change in the whole range of civilian policies, from climate, energy, land use, transport, and so on and so forth, have also actors normally dealing with security issues, either from the civilian side, like civil protection organization, or also from the defense military side. For example, the military considering to have mitigation policy where often the military sector has exemptions, and that could be a contribution to mitigation, or to help in relief operation, as they already do now in case of hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunamis and the like, whether they are linked to climate change or not. And as we know, with the science and climate change, extreme weather events have something to do with climate change. So by increasing the number of factors and increasing the attention to climate change also through the lens of security as a threat multiplier, that could be a sort of greening of security. Security considering not only defense issues, but considering environmental issues, human security issues at its core. The second scenario would be what I call the negative scenario. It's called war on climate. We cannot do a war on climate change. We cannot solve climate change and climate change impacts through military means. We have to address it through the whole repertoire of means in the energy sector, in the agricultural sector, in the transport sector, in the consumption and production behavior, and so on and so forth. As I said, military operations or instruments can help in relief or in analysis, but not in addressing climate change impacts, as they are mainly social, economic, and of course environmental. securitizing too much climate could lead to try to, solve the right problem with the wrong means. This has been, for instance, sometimes the case of manipulation of climate change security issues with regard to how to address migration. The third scenario, which I hope is not the most likely, but maybe it is what I call much ado about nothing, meaning we have elements of an even stronger alert on the importance of addressing climate change and impacts. There is some rumors made, a lot of strong declarations, some new actors appearing on the scene, and then there is some fatigue. There are some lobbies prevailing again to try to put things under the carpet. And once again, climate change declines as an issue, or at least it's mentioned as an important issue, but actions are not taken as strongly as they should to address it, both in terms of prevention, mitigation, and adaptation. So those are the three scenarios. I would not comment necessarily on the likelihood of one or the other. Of course, normatively, we hope for the first scenario, and definitely not for the second. Maybe the third scenario is what has been partly happening after Copenhagen, but we hope that, I hope at least, that this will not be the case in the future.